Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start our program, but we started a little bit later than the time we anticipated. But anyway, we are starting now. As we know that this is our celebrator, Imbokodo zelizwe lethu. We are still in August, finishing up August wethu as the Nelson Mandela Museum. Xa siqala ndizawucela uMiss Thwala azokwenza i-opening remarks for this gathering. Over to you, Miss Thwala. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Are you tired? Okay, ngiyaphila. Hayi, ngiyaphila nami ngiyajabula ukubona nibahle. Yeah. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and gracing our auspicious event, and I hope we are going to have a good time together. My name is Ngqila, like Unozoda has said, and I was asked to welcome you. So, on behalf of the Nelson Mandela Museum Council management and staff, I would like to firstly welcome our main speakers of the day, Tiffany Caesar from Michigan in USA, who came here to address us as women and men. And also Dr. Ngqila from Water University, who happens to also be our council member. Thank you so much, ladies. And thank you, everyone. I won't name you one by one, but you are all welcome. Feel free. And if you want to take off your jacket, you are free to do that. I don't want you to feel at home. I want you to be at home, because if I say feel at home, it means even though you feel like you are at home, but then you still know that this is not your home. I want you to own the space as your own home. So be at home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miss Thwala. Miss Thwala ke usamkele uthi masikhule ibhatyi zethu, sikhule ijezi abatshayo, sibe sekhaya. I think ke ngoku sizawungena kuvuthondaba. I-program yethu is not long, but it's very interesting because we have a visitor from Michigan, Miss Tiffany. Miss Tiffany is not the first time elapha South Africa, and it's not the first time elapha Nelson Mandela Museum. She worked with us for a very long time, and today she is plowing back to the museum. Ecam kwakhe ke sine beautiful lady and our council member, Miss Ngqila. Unayeke is part of us. She's always with us in whatever we are doing as a museum. She's part of us in every way. So, bazosilivela ezo zinto zimnandi zizawusinceda ekubhekeni phambili and nokuyazi into okokubana iimbokodo zethu zelizwe lethu zisenzele ntoni. I'm going to call upon Ms. Tiffany to deliver her speech. Over to you, Ms. Tiffany.
Moweni. I hope you all are well today. Are you all well? Can you hear me okay? All right, good. So today I will be presenting a paper on some research that I've been doing on a woman named Phyllis Dundala. But before I start reading the paper, I want to just share with you a poem that I wrote in lieu of Women's Month. Is that okay? Good, good. African women are the creators of the universe, giving birth to different galaxies, some still unknown to mankind. African women are warriors fighting seen and unseen battles in the mind and on the dirt road, protecting their loved ones with the shield of their arms, using their breast as a resting place, an armory of safety. African women are omnipresent, everywhere, simply God. Not just God incarnate, God genderless. For in the woman lies male and female. All things are born undefined before classification. African women are Winnie Mandela, mother of South Africa, activist Albertina Sisulu, entrepreneur and politician, Wendy Luhabe, dignitarian, Michelle Obama, writer, Alice Walker, Stellenbosch activist scholar Nomzamo, spiritualist Gogo Danelle Nlanzi, African-centered educator Makini Chimene, entrepreneur and philanthropist Oprah Winfrey, educator, activist Dr. Grupam, and Kanyam Nandi activist and storyteller Lillian. African women are you and me who acknowledge our African ancestry and heritage and are willing to accept and fight the obstacles of being African, colored simply Black. Recognizing the complexity, my essentialism is only in language. Oh, how I wish I could capture the sacredness and fierceness of the African woman, Imbokodo. The African woman who has possessed me for the last year with her untold and told story is Phyllis Dundala, who in a Jordanless position fought obstacles and carved out a name for herself as a radical mother, activist, writer, scholar, and survivor. Mama Phyllis was in 2 countries, connecting Africans in Africa with Africans in the diaspora, South Africa and the United States. In her timeless journey, creating what she called her autobiography, a mosaic. In books, we find a new world. We travel to unknown places and learn things from the protagonist's story. While I was a curatorial graduate fellow at the Nelson Mandela Museum in Mthatha, I spent some time in the research library. I challenged myself to read several books. However, the book that I read was A Life Mosaic, the autobiography of Phyllis Dundala. I began to take notes on the book before I knew what I was going to do with it. I became feverish about the text, especially when I learned that Phyllis Dundala spent almost 10 years in Detroit, Michigan, in exile, and died in a nearby county in Michigan. Luckily, I got a chance to explore her story. However, I'm still researching, and her story is an ongoing passion. So today I come and I share with you some of the research I have done on her that connects her story from the Transky to Detroit, Michigan, in celebration of Women for Women's Month. Phyllis Dundala was born January 7th, 1920 in Iditwa, South Africa, a town in the Eastern Cape that was previously a part of the Transkei Bantustan. Her hometown was the birthplace of Thabo Mbeki, who was the South African president preceding Nelson Mandela in 1999. Mandela, the first Black president of South Africa, was born in the neighboring town of Mvezo in 1918. There would be many Black South African scholars and revolutionaries coming from the Eastern Cape. And just like them all, Phyllis would make her own mark on the world. Phyllis Ndala speaks highly of the women in the Eastern Cape who raised her. Early in her autobiography, the reader gets a sense that she is okay in her power and womanhood, and she gives a celebratory experience about growing up in the Eastern Cape. For example, when she was very sick as a child, there was fear that she might die. However, she was raised by the women in the Transkei whom held herbal secrets that would revive her childhood. And she talks about her Aunt Ma bringing her an herbal elixir that saved her life. It was during those experiences that she was taught that women were healers. In discussing women's culture, she mentions the folk songs and, and states that they all seem to have been composed by women. And in these tunes, she heard stories of women appealing to their lovers. During these particular times, she learned that women were the holders of traditions. At an early age, her family recognized her as a very intelligent person. Due to her inquisitive nature and eagerness to learn, she went to school early. Her father, affectionately called Tata throughout the book, believed that men and women should be treated equally. Her loving and encouraging experience with her father taught her that women are competent, no less than men, equally of value to the family and their society. It is no surprise that she was one of the few women attending Fort Hare when it was dominated by men. Not only was she intelligent and asserted herself just fine, she was also beautiful and wanted by many of her male peers. She says so herself. She states, "I was a young lady, beautiful, elegant, hotly sought after by the young men at my college." It was during her Fort Hare days that she met the two loves of her life, Haley and A.C. Jordan. But she did not necessarily care. She was very focused on her education, but she talks briefly about their courtship. However, it was A.C. Jordan who caught her eye, and she ends up marrying him. She describes him as a man who introduced her to intellectual life, and he involved her in many intellectual pursuits. It was AC who actually helped her find her first job as a teacher. And when he helped her find a job, this was also part of his plan to capture her and make her his wife. Her relationship with her father, Tata, was one of love and respect. When she got married to A.C. Jordan, it was her father who gave advice that would tell any man how to treat his daughters. Some of those words included, "But there is one course you never took, and that is wife psychology, a strange course whose scope and content are not well defined. One discovers these as ongoing. Now that you are married, you're going to take this course, wife psychology. Going through it means patience, understanding, and endurance. You will not find any experts to help you along, for each case is unique." Her father continued to give advice. He stated, "I hope you will honor and respect your wife and listen to her advice. If you look around and count the number of men who have made something of themselves, you will find it is only those who heeded their wife's advice. Those who never did are nothing in the community." So the reason I just spend a little time talking about her relationship with her father, because this helps to describe Phyllis Ndala's attitude as well as her independence. Phyllis and her husband, A.C. Jordan, has 4 kids, and she was a mother, but not only a mother, she was also an activist as well as a writer. While still in the South Africa, she was at the forefront of advocating for the disposal of the Bantu education laws. that will cause millions of Black South Africans lack of access to equality of education. The type of education that will be offered will be one similar to in the United States that we call industrial education system. And both of these educational systems are similar because the goal was to create servants from the minority or Black people within the country. So during her time in South Africa, she spent time being an activist, being a part of different educational organizations and fighting against Bantu laws, but she was also a writer. Her first article title was The African Tragedy, and it was written in Africa South magazine, April to the June 1957 issue. She states, "It is the tragic story of thousands of young women whose life has been one long song of sorrow, burying one child after another. And lastly, burying the husband that lover she has never known as husband and father. To them, both men and women, adulthood means the end of life. It means loneliness, sorrow, tears, and death. It means a life without a future because there is no present." So in this brief paragraph, she's describing the challenges that many Black women had faced due to the apartheid system that caused a division in many Black families in South Africa. Her second article, The Widows of the Reserve, was also written in the Africa South. This article received international acclaim and was translated in French, Flemish, and Dutch. However, it was a publication in the African Treasury, an anthology edited by the prolific African-American writer in the United States, Langston Hughes, that helped the correlation of what was going on in South Africa to the same challenges that were happening in the United States. She even received a congratulatory note from Hughes himself for the article prior to the inclusion of it in 1960. In this article, she discusses the ill effects of the migratory labor laws that split families due to men leaving their homes, unable to take care of their wives and children, to strict legislative laws. Women are left on the reserves with children to raise a family by themselves, involving themselves in continuous hard labor due to the absence of a man. She states in the article, "And yet, this is the daily lot of 10,000s of African women whose husbands are torn away from them to go and work in the cities, mines, and farms because of migratory labor systems cannot take their wives with them because of the starvation wages they receive, are forced to remain in the work centers for long periods, strangers in a strange land, but equally stranger at home to their wives and children. These women remain alone in the reserves to build their homes, till the land, rear the stock, bring up their children." Prior to coming to the United States and living with her husband, A.C. Jordan, who has took his last academic post at the University of Wisconsin, she had already established herself as a South African writer with a special interest in how the current apartheid laws and regulation affected women, children, education, and the family in general. So during the apartheid movement, some people were able to leave South Africa, and A.C. Jordan, her husband at the time, was a prolific Africanist, highly sought out for many universities all around the world for his literary knowledge as well as his linguistic skills. So he received the chance to go first teach at UC Berkeley, And then after he went to UC Berkeley, he went to the University of Wisconsin. That was the last university in the United States that he attended. Because he went, Phyllis and the children also followed. However, while A.C. Jordan was in the United States, he dies. But instead of Phyllis coming back to South Africa, she decides to stay and live in South Africa and live in the United States as an activist. So what she ends up doing is, while she's in the United States, she goes to all these different groups talking about apartheid and the struggle of Black women to raise awareness. And so now I just want to spend a little time talking about Detroit, Michigan, because what happens is, after Wisconsin, she finds herself in Detroit, Michigan, where she was working at Wayne State University. So I just want to talk a little bit about Detroit. Black activism in Detroit, Michigan between 1960 and 1980 contributed to creating an environment for South African exiles to reside, while they continued forms of anti-apartheid activism in Detroit and around the United States. And at Wayne State University, in the African American Studies program, there were different type of committees. For example, there was the Detroit Committee for the Liberation of Africa. So in Detroit, Michigan, there was also different groups and organizations that were fighting for the liberation of different African countries. And because of this activism that was going on in Detroit, you will find at this period of time between 1960s and 1970s, a huge influx of African exiles living in Detroit. Right. One of the people who was living in Detroit was a guy named Gladstone M. Orlisi. And Gladstone was a friend of Phyllis. And he's the reason why Phyllis actually comes to Detroit after her husband passed away. And a little bit about Gladstone is that he was born on October 14, 1935, in the Cape Province of South Africa. He attended the same schools that many of the revolutionaries attended, such as Fort Hare. But he also came to the United States, where he received his Master's of Theology at Yale, and then he also received his PhD in theology from Harvard University. And he ends up working at Wayne State University. But before he even goes to Wayne State University, he is also going to different cities and also intermingling with the civil rights activists in the United States and telling people about the apartheid situation in South Africa. He even goes to the government and talks to the government, telling them that the challenges that South Africa was having. And he states in one of his campaigns against apartheid, South Africa is the only country in the world where denial of human rights and discrimination in every walk of life is based on color, is enshrined in the Constitution of Land. In South Africa, oppression is legal. The South African polio of apartheid has been attacked by nearly every nation in the world, almost every session of the United Nations since 1946. In all this time, there has been no response from the South African government except defiance and an increase in repressive authoritarian measures reminiscent of Hitler's Nazi Germany. So he was also in the United States campaigning against apartheid, not only going to different groups, but also complaining to the US government and saying this is why we need international support. He also was a pastor of the People's Community Church, described as one of the largest Black churches in Detroit, which was only a few yards away from the Pan-African Congress. While in Detroit, he was also a research associate at Wayne State University in the sociology department. Unfortunately, Gladstone, he returns to South Africa in 1979 and died due to the apartheid regimes, the same reason he fled. Unlike Phyllis Ndala, who stayed, and she returns to South Africa after the end of apartheid, Gladstone goes back and he's killed by the apartheid policies and government. The reason I have to talk about Mxolisi is because his story helps us to understand Phyllis' story. There are only two South African exiles that I kind of talk about who are in the United States during the apartheid movement, but both of these South Africans were going around raising awareness of the apartheid issues and trying to get international assistance. During the time that Phyllis was in Detroit, she writes a book called An African Tragedy, The Black Woman Under Apartheid through Agasha Productions in 1976. And Agasha Production was a Black radical publishing company in Detroit. And they wrote books like, Hey, Let a Revolutionary Brother or Sister Come In. And by the mere affiliation of Phyllis to this particular radical publishing company in Detroit, you can see what type of groups of people that were influencing Phyllis Ndala. And in the beginning of this book, she talks a little bit about her experience in Detroit, Michigan. She says, we, the refugees and exile, are still scattered over the world, still waiting and hoping for the day of our return. Some of us have accomplished the task for which we left our homeland, still in dire straits. We have not been welcome in the countries in which we are. Others, though allowed to stay, have not been allowed to work. Others still cannot work, for there is no work, so we wait, living off handouts from welfare. I really enjoyed this particular quote because she's talking about the challenges she's having being in exile in the United States. One of the things she mentions is this idea of possibly receiving handouts, welfare handouts from the United States government. So here's Phyllis coming from the Transkei, where she's representing a very high class life, and then she goes to the United States, and she was still doing well, and then her husband dies and she stays, and she goes into this despair, and she has a lot of challenges, but yet and still in her struggle of trying to survive in the United States, she's still able to write books that critique and talk about the apartheid system. One of the newspapers in Detroit also gave her a review, and he says, a South African now living in exile in the US who was active in the Great Black African Resistance Movement of the late 50s and early 60s. She writes with the sincerity and real feeling for the movement that only a participant can articulate. And this she does beautifully. So I found that to be extremely interesting, that she was able to get the eye of local newspapers who wrote about the book that she published while she was in Detroit. Now, also, I would like to mention that the ideal of Phyllis being in Detroit and also having relationships with some of the Black people in the United States is not odd. Due to these early partnerships between Black radicals, global concepts surrounded the need to create emancipation was was something that was happening due to Pan-Africanism. You have people like Steve Biko, who is the creator of ideas like Black consciousness, talking to people like Robert Moses from the United States and SNCC. And so you have these student organizations from South Africa and the United States talking to each other, engaging in global discussion to try to end the oppressions that they felt were similar. Stokely Carmichael, one of the Black activists in the United States, he says, Black people must redefine themselves, and only they can do that. Throughout this country, vast segments of the Black communities are beginning to recognize the need to assert their own definition, to reclaim their history, their culture, to create their own sense of community and togetherness. So similar, while in South Africa, there was this ideal on Black consciousness, in the United States, they had this ideal called Black Power, which were very much similar. This whole ideal of Black is beautiful and we should stand together for each other and try to recreate the images that have been distorted by white hegemonies. In conclusion, I just want to say that Phyllis Ndala is only one of millions of stories of South African exiles who traveled globally during apartheid. But her story is one of the stories that we can trace. It's a phenomenal story because she is a Black woman and she decided to stay and to create her own life for herself. And through that particular creation, she continued to write narratives about the Black woman experience in South Africa, which is very much so important. We need to continue to, I guess, revive the stories of Black South African women. When you read different scholarly articles about Phyllis Ndala, sometimes they're not quite right. So we need to figure out what are these scholars trying to say and how can we add truth to these particular stories. There needs to be new interpretations on Phyllis Ndala's story. One of the debates, one of the things people say is, why did Phyllis Ndala, why did she drop Jordan? You know, after her husband dies, she drops the Jordan. So there needs to be some research on understanding why she decided to go by Phyllis Ndala. Some people are saying that there's a lot of debate when it comes to surnames and things of that nature. Some scholars in South Africa are saying that the women's ancestors are not being acknowledged. So that's another point that we can go into. We need to reveal gaps in the knowledge system. Also, she's representative of contemporary women's literary knowledge. And we also need to illustrate that she is a woman who has chosen to overcome over and over and over again. Throughout Phyllis' story in the United States and South Africa, she's representative. She represents a woman who does not give up, you know, and she continues to write. And even in her relationships, she asserts herself as a strong and independent woman. We also need to digitize and republish her work. Right now, her work is scattered. So if we can start to digitize them and put them online, we can get to her work much easier. So before I go, I would like to thank you all for listening to my presentation on Phyllis Ndala. I welcome questions, comments as I continue to research and learn more about her story. I would like to thank the Nelson Mandela Museum, Stellenbosch University Museum, Michigan State University Museum, the MSU African Studies Center, Ubuntu Museums and Communities Connect, as well as Walter Sisulu University for allowing me to be here and present my research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Kanihlabelele kaloku usini madoda nobinye nje ke sibe nevavavum nje siye kugodola one qha. Ingoma zomama bo, hayi bo, ndinithembe kangaka, hayi bo, one. Andizuqalisa ke tana apha ningandiculelanga tu. Ndilindile bethuna liyahamba ixesha. Wathinta abafazi mntanam angekulunge. Ngekulunge. Enkosi kakhulu ke bantu bam. I am not going to do a summation of what Tiffany has said. Ukhona umntu ozawuyenza loo nto leyo. But ke, thank you very much, Ms. Tiffany. Nge-speech sakho, it was beautiful and it was well received. Ndibonile bengekho kwamntu who was talking. We were all listening to your speech. Thank you very much. Now we are giving to Dr. Ngqila azawusipha asiphathele kona naye for today. Over to you, Dr. Ngqila.
Molweni. I'm quite happy that we are all here. My presentation is not far from what she has presented, as it is also highlighting how the gender equality policy was received by the people and what were their interpretations of the gender policy and what were their doubts and hopes about the policy. And my presentation is kind of comparing the categories of people, especially women, whom I interviewed, and the relationship between their responses to my interviews. My research was kind of confined or focused on the KSD municipality, local municipality. I refer to the people who are occupying the KSD as the Southern Nguni people. because it's a mixture of people of different cultural, subcultural groups. Hence, I can't say it's a or them. And I'm mainly concerned about whether people are aware of the existence of the gender equality policy, the level at which the KSD people understand the meaning of the gender equality and empowerment policy, and the effectiveness of the policy or the impact it may have in their lives. And again, in addition to that, my focus again is on the correct and fair implementation of gender policy or gender equality policy without misuse or overstepping of the rights of the people, both women and men. Because when you're talking gender, we're not only referring to women, we are referring to both men and women. As qualitative research, I only interviewed 68 people, but with the hope that whatever responses they gave, those responses are representing what might be in existence out there in the whole of South Africa. But I can't generalize with my 68 people. Now, I started by looking at the literature review because I wanted to base my work as to what other researchers discovered in their areas of research. What they discovered is going to be relevant to my discoveries, or is it going to be refuted by my findings? So, firstly, I would like to, because what I'm going to present, it also touches on issues of culture. So I would like to first explain, according to my research, as to what I found as the origin of culture. How did culture develop? My own take, my own understanding was, as I gathered, that what we are hearing today as the trending ideas, the ideas we find on Facebook, the ideas we find on Twitter, on this and this, and we find this person being recognized as somebody who is trendy. Same thing happened in the past, whereby particular people would introduce ideas or practices, and those practices would be admired and followed over a period of time. And if that time goes into decades, then that becomes the traditional practice of that area, and it becomes assumed as the cultural practice of that area. And because nobody ever disputed the act, it then gets recognized as a well-received idea and practice, which becomes the common practice for the whole society. Then I began to look at this idea of gender inequality as to how it started. A research which was conducted in India, it does reveal that before the arrival of traders, and oh my goodness, sorry for that. Sorry. So when I did, when I tried to do dug into the story of the Indians, where Leacock conducted research. She realized that before the arrival of European traders with their capitalism, women did have autonomy. They did have space to decide as to how do they want to live their lives and what do they want to do in life. But when the traders arrived, they then introduced the idea of saying they can't have discussions in the presence of women. They only want to have discussions with men, and they can only do trade with men. And when they came, they also introduced the idea of property ownership, and that's when people decided or began to want to own land and other things. Because this trading was about the fare of certain wild animals. So they began to claim areas of land in which these animals were more common. Then that's when now women were pushed aside and seen as people who belong to the private domain and men belonging to the public domain, according to this researcher. And again, other researchers moving away from that, they are seeing women being oppressed socially, economically, and politically. And they are explaining how they say they came to that conclusion. When we look at the issue of social oppression of women, this researcher, who is Okin, states that natural function of women is to give birth to children